Ode on Indolence by John Keats. An ode is a song of praise, a poem of praise for a particular object or a theme or a concept. It can be quite formal, it can be a bit boring, a bit dum-de-dum, a little bit like a limerick. Old-fashioned odes can be quite strict and sometimes quite funny. Keats does something slightly different. When you approach a poem, any poem, be it an unseen poem or one you know very well, there's a good strategy to start you off, particularly if you're writing an essay for an exam. And that is basically start with rhyme scheme, look at metre, and then draw some conclusions about the form of the poem. So if we look at rhyme scheme on this first stanza, we can see it goes A, B, A, B again, then it'll be C, D, and following. This is how we annotate poems' rhyme schemes, just using the alphabet in order. So the first rhyme is A, the second is B, and so on and so forth. And then you can see the repetitions and the style, and you can judge from that as to whether or not it is a formal rhyme scheme or no rhyme at all, blank verse, or whether there are varieties of rhyme scheme. And very formal rhyme scheme might be couplets, for instance. Now this rhyme scheme is formal, A, B, D, D, E, C, D. And so the next thing to look at is metre, which is basically the number of beats in a line, or the number of syllables. Now this seems to be 10, which means 5 pairs of syllables, which are often called feet. And that suggests an iambic pentameter. All of this suggests a sonnet. The stanzas are 10-line stanzas, and there are several stanzas. A sonnet is a 14-line stanza, just one, and it has a variety of forms within that, 8 and 6, or 3 quatrains and a pair. It varies according to who's writing it or how or what tradition that poet is following. But the form of the stanzas in the odes is like a sonnet, but only 10-line stanzas and more than one stanza. So he's picked up a formal rhyme scheme and a formal style and adapted it to his requirements for an ode. And an ode often is a longer poem than 14 lines. Okay, so the first line isn't by John Keats. It comes from the Bible. They toil not, neither do they spin. This is a biblical reference to the flowers, the lilies of the fields. They don't work, and yet they flower. It was an exhortation by Jesus in Matthew 6:28 to tell people to chill out a bit, really, and to not worry so much, because look at the lilies of the field. The flowers don't do very much, and yet they exist, and yet they are beautiful. So Keats is using this as a kind of anthem for his Ode to Indolence, and possibly the way that it was delivered by Jesus and in the Bible wasn't necessarily to suggest to people that they should be lazy, only that they should not worry. But Keats sort of takes it a bit further and suggests maybe it's just an excuse to not do anything, to not work. So then he commences the poem. And he commences this with a declarative onset. Onset just means beginning, but it's quite a good term if you're talking about literature, not just poetry. Once upon a time is an onset. So it's a nice, strong beginning. One morn, declarative. Before me were 3 figures. Figures suggests an abstract shape, but he certainly suggests with bowed necks, joined hands, side-faced, that they are in profile and that they are human figures, perhaps silhouettes. And I think there's a reason for this, which we'll see in a minute. He also uses the stresses, bowed and joined, to keep the sense of metre in the poem, to keep it formal. So what he's seeing is some, if you like, ghostly, not quite ghostly, but floaty vision-like figures, and they step serene hints at sleep. The whole thing hints at sleep. And there is a use of a semantic field of laziness, I guess, indolence, placid, serene, that emphasises the idea of a lazy day. He then uses a simile like figures on a marble urn, and that's why I think the figures that he first sees, joined hands, side faced, bowed necks, they're in profile. They look like the white marble figures that are on a terracotta urn, a Greek terracotta urn, very common Greek art, if you like, the sort of silhouette. And it's as if these three, I suggest women, young women, are walking hand in hand around this urn, their clothes floating out behind them. They're quite ethereal, which is the intention perhaps of the way those urns are created. A hint of sibilance. The urn turns, is shifted round, so you can see all of them as they move through, and they perhaps are circling in front of him in his vision. The reference to Phidian is a reference to Greek architecture. So the whole of the first stanza is creating an image as if the figures from a Greek urn have stepped off the urn and are circling around him on a warm day. We don't have a huge hint that it's a warm day yet, but we will find out a little later on. And there is a sense in which indolence and the lilies of the fields all suggest something quite warm and pleasant. He is personifying at the moment the idea of the concept of indolence as they wander in front of him. He is musing, perhaps, on muses, which is another word for those who inspire, or the spirits that might inspire poetry. And he calls them shadows in the second stanza. How is shadows that I knew ye not? How came ye muffled in so hushed a mask? So he's talking to them, but he's also asking rhetorical questions. He's not really expecting an answer. And the idea of hush a mask and the muffled, the use of the word muffled, is a little like hearing through sleep. You can't hear very well when you're under the blankets or when you're half asleep. So there is that sense of tiredness and a language field that constantly hints at being slightly dozy and slightly muted in your response to life. He uses deep disguised alliteration and a compound adjective. He's very fond of compound adjectives throughout his poetry. And, of course, the use of the word silent also hints at that muffled sense. The words steal away are a collocation, a pair of words. They're conspiratorial. We're used to hearing steal away together. It's an idiom as well as a collocation. It means to creep away. And he's suggesting that these visions are going to leave him without anything to do, that their whole intention is just to pass by him and not inspire him like muses. And benumbed my eyes, also using the semantic field of indolence, of laziness. All of it suggesting this lazy, drowsy, numb, muffled, don't want to do anything kind of day. And that slows him down so that his pulse grew less and less. Pain had no sting, and pleasure's wreath no flower. And that's an indication really that he's so drowsy and so sleepy, he's anaesthetised, so that neither pleasure nor pain has much effect on him. And then we do get a reference to that very hot summer. Oh, why did ye not melt and leave my sense unhaunted quite of all but nothingness? So there is a sense in which he is suggesting it's so hot that these visions could just melt away. Pass they by. In this next stanza, he talks about how they passed by him 3 times. A third time passed they by. He uses 3 a lot to reflect the 3 figures. The triadic is a common device in literature. 3 is reputedly easier to remember. It's used in rhetoric and speeches and other forms. That third line, then faded and to follow them I burned, that is an inverted rhyme. That's where the formal rhyme scheme is important. turned and burned. It would be more grammatically correct for him to say, then faded and I burned to follow them, but that wouldn't rhyme. So it's, and to follow them I burned. So then Keats follows this up with a bit of alliteration. Faded and to follow, each one the face a moment, then faded and to follow them I burned. So we have the inverted rhyme, we also have some alliteration. And then he starts to personify these figures that he can see. And the first one he personifies as love. He gives her an abstract name, and these are the things that matter to him, that are important to him. This is who he sees floating as if on an urn in the heat in front of him, shimmering perhaps. Everything about this poem kind of makes you want to go to sleep. Everything about this poem suggests that the poet is not feeling motivated today. The second one is ambition. He was ambitious to be a good poet, a recognised poet, someone who admired the romantic poets such as Shelley and Byron and wanted to be part of that group. And although he never knew it, on Shelley's death, Percy Shelley drowned, in his pocket was found a copy of Keats's poems. So even in death, Shelley and Keats were united. So the second vision is ambition. And then we see fatigued eye. Fatigued gives a little bit of extra beat. That's for the iambic pentameter. And it's also part of the semantic field of indolence and tiredness and laziness, which is crucial to this poem, which makes us all the time think we're going to go to sleep ourselves. And then finally, the demon poesy. By that he means poetry. The third figure is personified as poesy, and that's his most difficult muse, if you like. That's the one that he can't get to grips with. That's the one he ought to be doing, but that's the one that he finds difficult, and ambition is nothing without his poetry, and love in a sense is kind of useless. So then he moves on to the next stanza and a little bit more alliteration. Then a bit more faded and forsooth and folly, more alliteration, more rhetorical questions. I wanted wings, oh folly, what is love, and where is it? And more use of alliteration. Fever fit. And his problem is not ambition nor love, but poesy. She has not a joy. He finds the act of poetry difficult. It's mechanical as well as inspirational. And it's all very well thinking of a poem, but you have got to write it down. You've got to get its metre and its form and its rhyme right. You've got to choose the right words. And that's all difficult. And he's not feeling it at the moment. He really doesn't want to do it. He's happy with the evenings steeped in honeyed indolence. But despite all that, there is the possibility that he has to be sensible. And he asks, but who wants that? Oh, for an age so sheltered from an eye that I may never know how change the moons, or hear the voice of busy common sense. So he's kind of hoping that indolence will just sort of take him off and he'll never have to worry about being busy, about having to get up and write a poem and try and sell it and read it and earn a living. So in the next stanza, wherefore means why. It's an archaic way of saying why. He moves into metaphor here, embroidered with dim dreams. So this is, again, a bit more alliteration, but also the idea that his dreams are literally stitched or coloured with ideas. His sleep is literally stitched and coloured with dim dreams. Again, drowsy, not terribly clear. Indolence does not seem to lend any clarity. And then he mixes his metaphors a bit. The lawn besprinkled with flowers. So my soul had been a lawn besprinkled with flowers, or with flowers, and stirring shades and baffled beams. I think that kind of refers to beams of light. So his soul is sort of shimmering in the light and flowers. His dreams are kind of woven into his sleep a little dimly. The morn was clouded, but no shower fell, though in her lids hung the sweet tears of May. So it's May, and he personifies the morning as a lazy morning, heavy eyes on a warm day in May. The open casement pressed a new-leaved vine. The things are budding, opening, and the thrush, let in the budding warmth, and the throstles lay the thrush's eggs, the thrush's nest. O shadows, 'twas a time to bid farewell, upon your skirts had fallen no tears of mine. So now he's saying, I've really got to get going. I can't lie here all day. Oh shadows, these figures, 'twas time to bid farewell, upon your skirts had fallen no tears of mine. So I've actually got to hear the voice of busy common sense and get going. So, ye three ghosts, adieu. And he likes using adieu. He uses it in a lot of poems. Elsewhere, I think I've mentioned that possibly it was this kind of mix of references and languages that made people like Byron suggest that he was a Cockney poet or a suburban poet, and that was not meant as a compliment. He then goes on, you cannot raise my head cool-bedded in the flowery grass. He's lying in the grass on a hot summer day. Hard not to be indolent, that's the compound adjective, cool-bedded. For I would not be dieted with praise. There's no reason to praise me if I'm just lying here, a pet lamb in a sentimental farce. So he's sort of saying that there's an overload of cuteness. He means the way little lambs are praised and petted just for being lambs. He can't do that. He has to get out there and do something that is worthy of praise. And he's now talking to the figures again. Fade softly from my eyes and be once more in mask-like figures on the dreamy urn. And he's working with the idea that they have stepped off the urn and are circling around him, and they must go back now to the urn and just become solid figures and not disturb him with ideas of ambition or poetry or love. He must make his way to work, as it were. Farewell, I yet have visions for the night. Visions there is, and for the day, faint visions there is store. There are still things to do. And there are still things to see, still things to say. This is a summer vision, and he has to send those visions away because he must work. They must never more return. Then a bit more faded and forsooth and folly, more alliteration.